So, one of the most interesting things about leadership is that the more effective a leader you are, the more invisible your leadership. And people will then think you aren't really doing anything. You're not a good leader. So, when we're looking at leaders and leadership styles, the best leaders seem to be the ones, and by best, I mean the ones that are best regarded historically, are the ones where something horrible has occurred and that leader steps forward and organizes a response, an effective response on behalf of people that otherwise wouldn't be able to protect themselves, for example. Um, However, the most effective leader would have been able to prevent that from occurring in the first place, often. Or you have someone who's more of an authoritarian leader. They think that being a leader means being strong. And so they basically come out and they dictate at people and they tell them what to do and are high control people and creating a high control system. So people actually like that when they're afraid. They like that when there's danger. You're more likely to get a positive response to the high authoritarian, high control leader when things are very, very bad, but that does not make them a good leader. So the most effective leader is going to be the one who's the most invisible. They're they're behind the scenes a lot of the time, preventing problems from occurring in the first place. And the thing about it is that people will complain. If you do a good job, they will just assume, well, that's what you should have been doing. Or they won't even recognize that you've done a good job. They're going to find the things that are wrong to nitpick. There is never, I think of it as a law of conservation of criticism. The criticism never disappears. You never solve the problem. The criticism just moves to the next thing. So the more effective you are, the better you are. The criticism just gets nitpickier and narrower. People assuming that they could have done better were they in that particular situation with those same set of factors. And so you get a lot of backseat driving from people who think they know better and don't. So when I talk to my son a lot about leadership and effective leadership because you have an inkling about your children, so you just try to give them what you think they might need. And so I've had these conversations with him about like what effective leadership actually is. The most effective leadership where you don't get that criticism, but where you're able to gather everybody in a unified direction is the leadership where you are articulating for people something that they don't want to hear, but you've articulated it in a way that is helpful for them to get on board with whatever it is that's the next necessary action. So the reason why populist leaders, in my opinion, have massive problems is because they tell people what they want to hear. They tell people I will, and they'll make promises that they can fix whatever the thing is when they can. These are highly complex systems. So when you have a person who's telling people what they want to hear, you create a mob, and that could be your individual guru on the internet. That can be your populist politician. If you are telling a group of highly emotional people things that they want to hear, you have no longer preserved their individual identity. And I want to say it's Frank Herbert in one of the Dune novels, where he talks about how a leader is someone who preserves the individual, even when they're in a group. So when you get that momentum of people who are hearing what they want to hear, and therefore moving in the direction that they think is going to give them what they want, when in fact it's a monkey's paw because the person who's misrepresenting the situation cannot give them what they want. The lower the emotional maturity, the lower the emotional quotient, the EQ of the group that you're dealing with, the more of a mob you're going to have, and you get that when you're telling people what they want to hear about a thing that is very emotionally important to them. So I'll give you an example. I grew up in Miami at one point in my childhood, and I happened to live there during the Elian Gonzalez crisis. Now, I have a legal background, so I knew that saying that a child should not be with their father in this particular situation was going against international human rights. But I lived in Miami, which had a high Cuban immigrant population, and they were very emotionally triggered by the situation, and they felt that that person, that the child Elian, should not be going back to Cuba to his father, but should stay in the United States with people who were his family, but they were degrees removed from being like his direct immediate family. Also, there were some concerns about well, anyway. So you could not say anything in public that you disagreed with this group because they were essentially a mob and they had taken control over everything. There's like a reason why. I'm suspicious. Not suspicious in a conspiratorial sense, but I'm immediately on alert as soon as I see like what I think to be a mob mentality. Even if I agree with it. Like now I'm nervous, y'all. I don't like this because we've lost our ability to think, to discern, and to make individual choices. And then also we are going to castigate anybody who doesn't agree. So that's my example of that. When World War II, I think, gives us a really great example of effective leadership. So a good leader is going to be communicating to people things that they don't necessarily want to hear in a way that they will take it in and kind of coordinates everybody to move in an action that will help the group. So during World War II, they needed to get a lot of supplies to the soldiers, and I'm speaking for America here, to the soldiers. And so that meant that people at home were going to go without. They were going to have shortages. They were going to have, problems with food and food distribution. It was going to be asking a lot of the American people during that time. So, as an effective communication technique, telling people to do something they intrinsically maybe don't want to do, but giving them a reason to do it in a way that is for the benefit of everyone, something that everyone could believe in. So they came up with this sort of it's propaganda, but it was like a propaganda for an effective purpose. The purpose being that you needed to retool all of the manufacturing for wartime manufacturing and turn it away from consumer goods. That means the consumers have less goods to purchase. So already you're going to be asking people to go without. Additionally, you're going to be rerouting the food toward those soldiers. The logistics is the most important piece. You need to be able to make sure that your soldiers are eating, otherwise you're losing the war. However, now you're asking people at home to go with less food, have less access to food. So what they did was very smart, in my opinion. And so good leaders are able to articulate ideas and concepts in a way that people can emotionally connect with, but also make sense logically. Obviously this can be misused, but when you're using this power for good, this is what's happening. So that's when they came up with that language around the victory garden. And that's when they came up with that language around, being a part of the war effort on the home front. So you're making these sacrifices to support the soldiers who are out in the field, that you are now a part of this war effort. And so it's not just you are sacrificing and being forced to go without, but now you are given a way to buy into the process in a way that feels organic. And so you're hearing that you need to take an action that you wouldn't necessarily want to take, but you're being given a reason, a highly mimetic reason that allows you to take that action in a way that doesn't feel like that you're sacrificing your ability to make decisions for yourself. And so that's why I like that Frank Herbert definition so much of leadership, because it preserves the individual. And in any family dynamic, that's going to be as true as well. The good leader in a family, the good parent, is still preserving everybody's ability to make decisions for themselves. They're presenting the information in a way that's clear, that's concise. They're going to be telling you what you need to hear, maybe not what you want to hear, but it will be with empathy and from your perspective. And so I find that a good leader is somebody who is a clear communicator and is able to articulate complex ideas in a way that people can take ownership of it and then make decisions based off of it. But they're more likely to make the decision that they should be making because you're giving them kind of the right framework to understand it. So for example, in a family dynamic, if you are a parent and you have a child that's maybe not being on business at school, maybe the grades are slipping or something. Um, what you might do is you say, okay, instead of coming in a coercive way or a forceful way, you just look at it and you say, okay, well, there are these other activities that you are doing, and it's clear that there's too much on your plate for you to be effectively doing the main thing that you should be doing, which is your schoolwork. So why don't we take some of these other options off of your plate and we can build them back in after you start making the A's? Essentially, what you're doing is you're making life annoying for them. You don't get to do the things you want to do if you are not making the grades you should be making. Like, we shouldn't be making D's or whatever the bad grades are. So you might say, so this lets me know you have too many activities and we need to roll some of these back. Or maybe you take back the electronics access, because that's not a right, that is a privilege. And so it's just like, oh, to help you stay more focused, because clearly there's a higher level of distraction that's interfering with your ability to do your schoolwork, right? So a poor leader, a high control, high authoritarian leader, bad leader, it's going to come in and they're going to try and control another person. They're going to say, you need to do this, and if you don't do this, I'm going to do it at you. And so while that can be effective in the short term, that is generally counterproductive in the long term. So when I'm looking at like these systems of leadership, or these systems of, how do we have a healthy relationship with power, and what actually works? What actually works long term is honestly when you're a good communicator and when you understand why you are telling people to do what they should be doing, and you're giving them that framework so that they can make the decision of whether or not they agree with you. And I will say, as a parent, sometimes my son, well, not many, I feel like there's a couple of times my son has disagreed with my reasoning and logic about it, but he'll still go ahead and do the thing that I'm telling him to do, because I've got like fallback logic for it, that I then engage when he's kind of moving in that direction. It doesn't generally happen. And I also will say, as I've proved myself over these years as someone who's, always had your best interests in mind and is making these decisions even in ways that you don't understand. But now that you're older, that you do, you can trust that I'm continuing in this particular process. So it's I'm again, I'm not giving like a hard and fast rule here, because sometimes people get very weird about that and they're like, well, it has to be done this way. That's not what I'm saying. Let's be flexible. But in general, broadly speaking, anything that allows you to preserve the level of the individual while also moving them in a direction they may not intrinsically want to move, but you are giving them kind of inspiration to do that. You're giving them a reason to buy into why they should. I think, in my opinion, is essentially what makes an effective leader. Anyway, I hope this makes sense, and I'll talk to you next time.